Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm here with our 9 News medical extraordinaire expert, technically, Dr. Payal Kohli, for a bit more on what you should do if you test positive for COVID. So this is really important. Obviously, unfortunately, we're seeing the increase in cases right now. So for a bit more on what you should do, Dr. Kohli, first of all, testing. Let's start things out there, because if you get that, let's say, a rapid test back positive, what's the maybe first thing you should do right after that?
Chris, we're in such a different place than we were a couple of years ago with testing positive and what we're supposed to do. So I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. If you get a rapid test that's positive and you're symptomatic, you're confirmed COVID. So there's really no need to follow up with a PCR test. Now, let's say you get a rapid test and you're not symptomatic, then I might recommend a PCR test for confirmation, because there's a small possibility that the test could have been contaminated, especially if you live with somebody who's COVID positive. The test could have gotten contaminated, and that's why it's testing positive. So a positive test you can pretty much hang your hat on. Now, the opposite, if you have symptoms and you do a rapid test and it's negative, you don't stop there. 100% of the time you have to follow that with a PCR test. Because of the vaccines, we're in a different place now than we were a couple of years ago. So a couple of years ago, when we tested positive and we had symptoms, the symptoms were a result of a very high viral load. So the minute that you have symptoms, there's a lot of virus around. Now, because we're vaccinated, it takes just a few small viral particles to tickle our immune system. The immune system goes to war, and the symptoms are actually coming from the immune system's response. And so it could come out negative on a rapid test because there's not that much virus around. But if you got that PCR test where you amplify the virus's genetic material, you'll actually see that it's positive. So definitely follow up if you're symptomatic and get a negative test. The other thing you might want to do is to do serial rapid testing. If you're symptomatic with a negative test, means do a rapid test every day until your symptoms resolve.
Okay. So let's say you come back positive on the PCR or with that series of rapid tests. What's the next step you should do?
So the first thing I tell people to do is don't panic, because it's not, at this point, if you're vaccinated and boosted, it's very unlikely that you're going to get super duper sick. But the second thing I tell people to do is to replay the last 5 to 7 days of their life in their head and make a list of all their potential contacts. And as a courtesy, just call everybody that you might have come into close contact with and just let them know that you tested positive and that they ought to get tested, because that's something, we still very much need to do. Now, if you're on public transportation or something where you don't know who you might have come into contact with, that's a little bit out of your control. It's usually a good idea to report it to the state, because they are tracking the positive tests. So especially if you do an at-home test and you're not doing it in a lab, you should call up the state and let them know. And then the last question, and probably most importantly to ask yourself, is do I qualify for antivirals? Because most people, if they miss that 5-day window from the onset of symptoms, won't be able to get the antivirals again. But there are a subset of people that qualify for antivirals and should get them.
What's that group of people?
So that's usually the people who are at high risk. They have mild to moderate illness. So, most people who are in the outpatient setting, mild to moderate illness, and they're at high risk for progression to severe illness or hospitalization. Now, we normally think about the high risk groups as immunocompromised or those with cancer or chronic disease, but one we forget about often is just being old. So over the age of 65 is considered a high risk for hospitalization because of your age being the risk factor. So if you're over the age of 65, even if you're otherwise pretty healthy, you're likely to benefit from taking Paxlovid, which is that antiviral, because it reduces the duration of symptoms, it reduces your infectivity, meaning your risk of infecting others, and it reduces your risk, of course, of getting into the hospital. There's some new data that it may actually reduce your risk of developing long COVID as well, potentially. So I think all of those factors put together, make a call to your doctor, let them know you're tested positive, and ask them whether or not you qualify for the antiviral. And if you're not sure, always a good idea to call your doctor.
So call a doctor. Let's say, hypothetically, let's ask for a friend here, and you're 34, reasonably healthy. Do you consider some of those options, those treatment options?
So you may still want to consider it if you live with somebody who's at high risk for having COVID, because remember I mentioned it decreases your infectivity. There's some new studies about prophylaxis. So let's say you got exposed to COVID-19, or you live with somebody who's got COVID-19 and you're high risk, should you prophylactically or preventively take the Paxlovid? Unfortunately, they didn't hit statistical significance. So there was a lower rate of infection in the contacts who took Paxlovid, but it was only a small difference and it didn't hit statistical significance. So it's not clear whether they started it too late for it to be effective, because by the time they got the medicine, they had already been exposed to their partner and already kind of developed COVID. But I think for the most healthy young people who have no other medical problems, if you're living alone or you're living with somebody who's also very healthy, you probably don't have to worry about the antiviral. But again, when in doubt, just make a phone call to your doctor and check.
Let's say, hypothetically, you get COVID and your partner or you're living with somebody or you got roommates or something, they are not testing negative. I mean, obviously you isolate in a room. Anything else you can do? Is it wiping down counters? What do you do in that situation?
You know, I think avoiding sharing a bathroom would be key if that's possible. Because that's when, if you think about it, you know, we're aerosolizing droplets, we're in the shower, we're blowing our nose, we're washing our hands. A lot of contamination can occur, especially in the bathroom. So I think that's a big high-touch surface I would definitely wipe down. You want to be careful not to share food, of course, and not to share utensils. If possible, try to even wash your utensils a little bit sort of separately, just to make sure there's no cross-contamination, you know, using the same dishwasher or what have you. These are all very extreme precautionary measures, but most of the times, if you're living with somebody who's vaccinated and boosted, wearing a mask, I think, is going to be the biggest way in avoiding direct contact. Because as we've talked about before, the primary mode of transmission is person to person. Very small amount of transmission occurring through fomites or surfaces. So we have to worry less about wiping down stuff and more about coming into close contact with somebody, coughing on somebody. Making sure you open up the windows too, Chris. That's a big one. Especially now that it's spring and the weather's a little bit nicer. You want to make sure there's a lot of fresh air coming in, good ventilation wherever you're living, so that you're not sharing that same air.
So no stuffiness. I think that goes probably with or without COVID. But
that's right.
Let's start getting out of COVID. So you're starting to feel maybe a little bit better. By the way, should you test on a daily basis even when you have those worst symptoms, or when do you stop testing?
Great question. So I would say that once you test positive, you don't need to keep testing.
Okay.
So you test positive, you have it. The time to start testing again would be with the resolution of symptoms, or when there's been at least 24 hours without a fever.
Okay.
Whichever one sort of comes first. And you could start with a rapid. Because if the rapid turns negative, you at least know that your infectivity or viral load has probably gone down. Your PCR may stay positive for several weeks after COVID. And it may not necessarily be infectious particles, it may just be fragments of the virus that are left behind, because your cells are chewing up the virus and breaking it down, and you take little pieces of the genetic material and you amplify it, and it looks like you're positive when you're actually not. So I think, you know, the first time to test would be resolution of symptoms or improvement in symptoms. That's substantial. And then once you're negative on a rapid test, you may or may not want to follow it with the PCR test. But if you do follow it with the PCR, at least wait for 2 weeks from day 0, which was the first day that you had symptoms, before you get that PCR test.
Okay. So when can you go back to work and start doing normal things?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. So, you know, in the crunch of the workforce, when we were down on staff in the hospital, the CDC actually issued guidance that you can come back to work 5 days after the onset of your symptoms, as long as your symptoms are improving. They don't even have to be resolved. And you've been fever-free for 24 hours without fever medicine. And you should probably wear a mask for those 5 more days that you're at work. So no testing. So this is called a symptom-based return to work strategy, which basically means your symptoms are getting better. It's been 5 days, you come back. The downside of that, of course, is that a lot of people, a large proportion of people, are infectious still at 5 days, because the average infectivity can last 9 to 10 days. So you really want to be careful, especially if you're in an environment without a mask where you're coming into close contact with people. Now, if there's not a huge crisis shortage of workforce at your office, I would say the testing to return to work strategy is a much more conservative strategy, and something that I personally would recommend, which is that symptoms are getting better and you're testing negative on a rapid test. It doesn't have to be the PCR, but you're testing negative on a rapid and your symptoms are better. That would be the right time to come back to work.
Can I ask, though, based on what you're saying, I mean, you want to be conservative about it. Let's say it's, again, you're saying it's not critical to be back to work. Isn't 9 to 10 days the best time to go back then? 9 to 10 days after?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and the reason that they're saying 5 days is because you're most infectious about 1 or 2 days before your symptom starts and about 3 days after your symptoms start. And then your infectivity really starts to go down. And this is based on studies in people who are vaccinated and boosted. So these are people like us who have had the, if you've never had the vaccine, then that whole timeline shifts because your immune response changes and all of that stuff. But for people who are fully vaccinated, that 5-day window, 2 days before and 3 days after your symptoms is when the highest infectivity is. But you're still infectious. Like I said, for an average of 9 to 10 days, some people can be up to 14 days because the incubation period of the virus can vary. And it can vary in different people. So the Omicron variant has a shorter incubation period than the previous variants, including the original and the Delta. But even in you versus me, it could be different because it depends on how much viral dose we're exposed to. So how much initial virus did you get really determines how quickly it divides, and that determines your infectivity.
Any final tips for people who have COVID and what they should do?
You know, as the numbers, I think, start to go up, we really, I think, need to be sort of proactive about our health. One thing I would really advise people not to do is to just say, oh, everybody's going to get it. And to, if you're feeling well and you're testing positive, to sort of live your life as usual. I think that is not a good idea right now because it can, you know, create more infection, which can create more variants and can create really more problems down the line. But just remember that if you do get it, don't panic, don't be ashamed. If you're doing all the right things, you know, there's so much infection around us right now that you could still potentially get it. Just have a low threshold to call your doctor if you have any questions.
Low threshold, call the doctor, follow those steps. So Dr. Payal Kohli, thanks so much for your time here on 9 News Plus today.
My pleasure.